I'm well, Rob, and great to talk to you. And you're on the ground in Queensland where there is something very significant that's developing. And you might even say sneaky things. While we were all having a little bit of a break on a holiday, the Queensland Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Bill. Give us your insights into what's happening in the state of Queensland.
Yeah, Neil, this sure is a bit of a sneaky bill. It was introduced by the Attorney-General on the last sitting session of Parliament in December. So that was on the on 2nd of December last year. And what it does, Neil, it allows people to change the records on their birth certificate, and in particular their sex. So that's a very a kind of a radical thing. It basically goes beyond the scope of gender identity, and it goes directly to the birth certificate. So the birth certificate obviously is a historical document, and it has historically provided accurate and factual data surrounding the live birth of people. What this bill does, Neil, is that the Queensland government will essentially legalise the falsification of birth certificates, which means that people can then enter their sex as whatever they like, and they can do it every 12 months.
Okay, now, Rob, it's a big call, isn't it, for legislation like this, and it's still not passed, so no doubt there's going to be something that listeners today can speak up and have their say. But sex is not a social attribute, and some have argued that about gender. As you say, this is a little bit different because this is a biological fact here with sex, either born male or female. That's a social attribute, can't really just be changed so easily.
That's right. This is a big step. It takes the whole gender identity argument out of the social realm and into science. So basically it's a contradiction of science. And the consequences are fairly obvious to most sane people, at least. The interesting thing here, Neil, is that we've actually gained some allies from unexpected areas. So people like radical feminists are up in arms over this. Lesbian groups are also not happy about it, and neither they should be. The consequences are obvious to me. They're obvious probably to you and your listeners. Areas like female safe spaces, for instance, that whole aspect of it on its own, if that was the only thing that was affected, is such a serious thing. And the problem here, again, I mean, there are many, many problems, but the Attorney-General also happens to be the Minister for Women, and it just, to me, it is mind-boggling that the Minister for Women would literally throw Queensland women under the bus with this bill.
Interesting too, Rob, these records, they're historic, aren't they? So if we were looking back through our own family tree, no doubt the way our family tree sort of comes together is because of records like this. And wouldn't it be sort of odd to be looking back through your family history and see your great-great-grandfather gave birth to a child, which we'll all know biologically happens when you are a woman. Now, this is interesting because you change these birth certificates, as you say, legalising the falsification of birth certificates. It's got huge ramifications.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. That's an interesting point. I've just finished doing a family ancestry for our family, and it was a lengthy process with many rabbit warrens. Look, I presume that there would be an audit trail for those kinds of things, but it's just mind-boggling that you can have two fathers, one of whom have given birth to the baby. Those things just introduce complications that I don't think society is ready for. The other thing I think, Neil, that we must remember here is that this bill is aimed at the radical part of a small group of society. So the vast majority of society, the vast majority of Queenslanders only have the downside on this bill. And I'm not sure that the government's thought that through well. I think it probably smacks of, corruption to the degree that there is conversations going on between the trans lobby and the government, and yet at the same time, feminist groups have been shut out of those conversations. That bothers me. I think that's something that we should look at closely.
Rob, you say that you'd be able to change your sex on your birth certificate once a year. Is there, in some sense, if you were looking for any sort of upside, the way that someone who may have some level of dysphoria around their sexuality, whether they may be able to at least set things right as something settles in their own heart and mind? Is there something there that might actually mean that something like this could self-settle? I know there's all sorts of other dangers, but that thought comes to me as we're having this conversation.
Yeah, look, that is true. There are many people that are de-transitioning. That's a big phenomena. The kind of damage that's done in the meantime, though, and the collateral damage, the increase of inquiring young people, I guess, is a real concern. You might have seen the recent statistics that came out last week that revealed a youth survey that suggested that 1/3 of young people are now, and I think it was 15 to 24, the age bracket, are now identifying as LGBTIQ plus whatever. My suspicion there is that the Q aspect of that, the questioning side of that is the overwhelming factor. This bill raises questions with young people that should be settled on the basis of science. And unfortunately, I think the upsides are far outweighed by the downsides. But I take your point. I think it's a good thing that people can go backwards. But it's a kind of a crazy argument when we look at the downside.
Rob, are you across what's happening in Queensland, and this is the current issue, but how's that comparing to what's happened in other states and territories around the nation? Do you know?
Yeah, a little bit, Neil. This bill mirrors fairly much what took place in Victoria. So their birth, deaths and marriages amendment bill was also very similar to this. Look, from the outside, it appears that Victoria and Queensland are in some kind of sprint to be the most progressive state in Australia. And at this point, this bill pushes Queensland ahead, unfortunately. And I use that word progressive in a not so positive way. It seems like we're racing towards, self-destruction, and those two states are definitely leading the way.
And not only that, but cause for complications. And it seems to be that when you're in a state of confusion, people can legislate all sorts of things. And I note that the Queensland Law Society's called for an audit of all state legislation and policies referring to sex and gender in order to clarify the rules. Now, if you got the rules clarified in one state, then you've still got all the comparison with every other state and territory, haven't you?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. And so rightly, the Queensland Law Society has raised that issue of, okay, if you can change your sex every 12 months, that's one thing. But the other thing is, when a child is born, the parents can then opt to nominate no sex on the birth certificate so that they can then wait for the child to make its own decision as it grows up. Now, there is incredible problems in that, and I think one issue that's been raised by the Associated Christian Schools, and I believe that they're a part of a public hearing that's happening tomorrow that I'm also a part of, and their argument will centre around single-sex schools. And so what do you do with a child, for instance, that hasn't yet nominated their sex? There are incredible problems, and this bill is so radical that it has introduced a whole bunch of problems in the quest to try and solve a single problem for a minority group.
And Rob, always good to come back to a foundation for where Christians come from when they're thinking through these sorts of issues, because Christians come from a place of authority because we say we're created in the image and likeness of God, man and woman. And some might say, oh, well, there's got to be all sorts of nuances and such things. But the foundation is a solid one. It's a firm one. It's held history to this place. And this is where ACL comes from too. It's understanding the presence and power of God in the circumstance.
That's right, yeah. Neil, we're always going to come back to a biblical position. We're always going to come back to a truth place. I think that ACL is a wonderful group. I've been with ACL for 12 months. One of the things I love is the Scripture is our final authority, and we believe that God, as you said, has created man in the image of God, female and male. And that is just such a great thing. And when we get those things in order, society just works. Things work. We don't introduce complications. I believe there's also compassion in that, Neil, because the truth will always set people free. And so it's really important that we don't start messing around with these things that come down to basic biological fact that God's put in order.